at the top of page 5, which is in the middle of a section on inspections. And so, Sarah, if you could just briefly scroll up to the end of page 4, right here is the inspection section. And just a really quick review, most buyers will elect to get an inspection and make their offer contingent upon the inspection, but some buyers nowadays are not. They're opting out of getting an inspection. So this is, of course, optional for buyers. And then on line 179, it's does or does not allow, the seller does or does not allow intrusive testing. And most often people do the does not, because really, literally, intrusive testing could be opening up walls, that kind of thing. So anyway, let's go back down to, we're still in the same section here, okay? And so the inspection, and I'll start right at the top. We've got the date, of course, and the property address at the top of like all the pages. And on line 184, it says seller will provide access to attics and crawl spaces. This is pretty important. Sometimes the trapdoor to attic spaces might be sealed, and inspectors won't unseal those, okay, because that's considered intrusive testing. So it's important that the seller has and allows access to everything, okay? Now, line 185, it says the time period that the inspection contingency lasts. So we've got here in this example, 10 calendar days. This is all part of the strategy. A buyer typically wants a longer contingency. That gives the buyer more time to be able to back out of a purchase agreement. A seller typically wants a shorter contingency, okay? They want to be certain that this buyer is going to stay on board and that they're going to make it to closing, and they don't want to lose market time, okay? During this 10-day contingency, you know, the buyer could wait until the 10th day and then back out, and the seller has lost all of that time on the market, essentially. So this is a very strategic choice here, and we are seeing, in many cases with multiple offers, we're seeing many buyers that are waiving the inspection contingency altogether, and they're just not getting a contingency. Or alternatively, for buyers that are getting contingencies, we're seeing shorter time periods here. So I would say historically, most of what I've seen over the years is like a 5 to 10 day time period. And now we're seeing more that are 5 days and sometimes 3 days, 4 days, 3 days. And Sarah, you mentioned 1 day, you know, as a possibility. And obviously it's really important to communicate with the inspector in advance to see how quickly they can get you an appointment to look at it. So this is all strategic. So 185 within 10 calendar days of final acceptance of all inspections, tests, and resulting negotiations, if any, shall be done. This is the inspection period, okay? A couple other things I want to point out here. These are calendar days, not business days. So, and not holidays, calendar days. So these days count every single day, including Saturdays and Sundays and holidays. They're all counted in this time period, okay? And of final acceptance date. So to understand what that means, final acceptance is when the purchase agreement has been accepted and delivered by and to all parties. So buyer makes an offer, seller accepts the offer, they sign it, okay? And then the signed copy has been delivered back to the buyer. That is the date of final acceptance. That date should be written on the purchase agreement as the final acceptance date. That's something that we'll cover later. But that's the date of final acceptance when everyone has signed and or initialed. All of that stuff is finally agreed to, and everybody has received copies. It's been delivered, okay? So that's final acceptance. The next day is day 1 of the inspection contingency, okay? So if you have 10 calendar days, you get final acceptance on Monday, day 1 is Tuesday, okay? And then it says, this is the time period for all inspections, tests, resulting negotiations, if any, and that's all part of the inspection period. So going on to the next paragraph on line 187. If this purchase agreement is contingent upon inspection, buyer may cancel the purchase agreement based on the inspections or test results by providing written notice to the seller or licensee representing or assisting the seller of the buyer's intent to cancel no later than the end of the inspection period. Okay, so this contingency gives the buyer the right to cancel. And if the buyer wants to cancel, that sentence explains how. They must give written notice by that time period to the seller, okay? And it says, or the licensee representing or assisting the seller. It doesn't say, but it is acceptable for the buyer's agent to send that written notice, okay? So written notice could be a letter, it could be an email. We pretty much all use emails now for this because you have electronic documentation that the notice has been provided. All right. I would recommend anyone that is in a situation where their buyer is thinking of getting out of the sale, the purchase based on the inspection, to check in with us on doing this, essentially, because we want to make sure that the seller is not going to give you any problems. Sellers and their agents sometimes might object, or they might be upset, or what have you. Understandably, they're probably going to be upset. I usually do, an email, and I make it clear in the message that this is in fact notice of the buyer's intent to cancel. And I'll even reference these words, these lines in the purchase agreement. So I'll indicate, that the buyer is canceling. This is notice of the buyer's intent to cancel in accordance with lines 187 through 189 on the purchase agreement. Okay. Next sentence. If the buyer cancels this purchase agreement, the buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to the buyer. Okay. And so that basically, the notice of cancel isn't actually canceling it. The actual cancellation of the purchase agreement is that cancellation agreement signed by both parties. Okay, but the wording in here is very important. The wording in here gives the buyer the right to cancel. And if the seller refuses, and if the buyer has to initiate a statutory cancellation, this is what's considered declaratory language. And this is a type of a statutory cancellation that cannot be cured by the seller because the purchase agreement has directed that it will be canceled if the buyer does give the notice. Okay, so that's just kind of an aside note there. The next sentence, if the buyer does not cancel this purchase agreement before the end of the inspection period, then this inspection contingency shall be deemed removed, and this purchase agreement shall be in full force and effect. So what that means is, as of the end of the 10 days, like the end of the 10th day at 11:59 or whatever, if the buyer has not canceled, then this contingency is removed, okay? And the purchase agreement shall be in full force and effect. Okay, now I want to be clear here. The buyer might try to renegotiate. And so the buyer's agent might send an amendment to the listing agent that says the buyer would like the seller to make the following repairs or reduce the price or whatever. That's an attempt to renegotiate, okay? That email, with the amendment to renegotiate is not a notice of cancellation. So in other words, if the seller does not respond to that amendment, to that request to renegotiate, within the inspection time period. And if the buyer does not also give notice of intent to cancel, okay? If the buyer does not give notice of intent to cancel and the seller does not respond to the request to renegotiate, then the purchase agreement shall be in full force and effect. And the seller is not obligated to do any of the repairs requested by the seller or by the buyer, okay? One other point I want to make clear here. Many people mistakenly think that the inspection contingency gives the buyer the right to renegotiate. Some people even think that the seller is obligated to do repairs that the buyer requests. Now, not many people think that, but some people do actually think that. And some people think maybe kind of in the middle that if it's like a health and safety issue or something, that the seller is obligated to do that. And I want to make it perfectly clear, the seller is not obligated to do any repairs that the buyer requests. This inspection contingency does not give the buyer the right to renegotiate. It gives the buyer the right to cancel, okay? The right to renegotiate already exists, but not unilaterally, okay? So neither party can really has the unilateral power to renegotiate, but both parties together, buyer and seller, have the right to renegotiate not only during this contingency, but all the way up until the date of closing if they agree on something. Okay, so that right to renegotiate already exists, but bilaterally, not unilaterally. Okay, this inspection contingency does not give the buyer the right to renegotiate. It gives the buyer the right to cancel, and that gives the buyer leverage. Okay, plus the fact that they had the inspection done and they have new information that they didn't know before, you know, that they might very likely share with the seller, you know, we want to renegotiate because of this and this and this, okay? So the buyer has some leverage, which may help them renegotiate, but there's not an obligation for the seller to renegotiate here, okay? Does anyone have any questions? And does Sarah and or Nick have anything to add on the inspection section? And welcome, Nick.
Hey, well, sorry I'm late. One thing I wanted to add, and you may have covered this, Pat, with this section, is that if, 10 days, that encompasses the inspection, the report, the, analyzing it with your buyers, and then negotiating with the other party. So sometimes you're going to run really close to the end of that calendar. Okay. And what you can do is send an amendment over to the other party saying, we'd like to extend line 185 to 15 days, or don't let it expire. Don't let it expire for your buyers, unless your buyers are confident that, they're fine, or, whatever, you can just let it expire. But if you don't want to let it expire, make sure you extend it.
Really good point, because the clock is ticking, and these are calendar days, not business days. It's
Right.
clicking. Yep. And if you let it expire, then this purchase agreement shall be in full force and effect as it is. So really good point. Any other questions out there or anything? Okay. Now on lines 194 through 197, it has the option here to indicate other inspection items. So, like if you want to get a radon test, for example. So that's kind of a standard wording that we often put in here. And I'm going to point out that most general inspections, the service providers, the inspectors, offer a general inspection, which doesn't include a radon test unless you pay extra for it. Another common extra that people get would be a sewer line scope. Okay, that's pretty common. And then other, things, sometimes extra inspection of a chimney, for example, the interior of a chimney, could be, if we get back to intrusive inspections, could be, drilling little holes in siding and so forth to try to look for moisture content, things of that nature. So there's any number of things. You could have a regular inspection and a really old furnace, and the inspector might even recommend, have a heating contractor come and take a closer look at the furnace because they have specialized equipment, So you can put stuff in there, but really the inspection contingency itself kind of gives you the right to do multiple inspections. So if you didn't put in radon test, you can, if you can get it in that time period, you can get it in, if the seller allows you to go in and out of the house, a couple of times to get that done. So let's move on. We've got a whole section on the sale of a buyer's property. And I don't see these as often with contingencies on the sale of a buyer's property. And honestly, through my career, I haven't used these too often. And nowadays, I think in this really super strong seller's market, they're probably used even less frequently than they have in the past. But historically, we've had oftentimes had buyers that want to move. They already own a house. They want to move into a new house, and they can't afford or qualify for 2 mortgage payments, right? And the only, so they have to sell first, essentially. They need to sell. And what they want to do is they don't want to have to move twice or be out in the street or have to live in a hotel or whatever. They want to be able to sell their home and then move into the next home the same day, basically. But for whatever reason, we have situations where it's best for the buyer to make an offer that's contingent upon the sale of their home. Okay, so we got a couple of options here. And if the buyer, elects them, they basically should, the purchase agreement instructs the buyer to check one of these 3 options. Okay, so the first option is that this purchase agreement is subject to an addendum to purchase agreement. And the addendum is titled Sale of Buyer's Property Contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. So there is a whole addendum that we use for that, which we're not covering today. But that's an addendum that is, it's changed a little bit, but much of it's been pretty similar for the last few decades, as long as I've been in the business. And it's essentially an addendum, which is a contingency that says this purchase is contingent upon the sale of the buyer's house. Contingencies on the sale of a buyer's house, their current house, allow for the seller to, they're not in a situation where they're waiting for a purchase agreement. They already have a purchase agreement, so they're using this second option here. Okay, so if the buyer's property does not close by the closing date specified in this purchase agreement is canceled. Okay, so in other words, the closing date on this purchase agreement is still very much enforceable. And so if the sale of the buyer's property gets delayed in any way, shape, or form, and if that delays the closing on this purchase, then this purchase agreement is canceled. And the buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to the buyer. The language in this paragraph supersedes any other provision to the contrary in any financing contingency made a part of this purchase agreement, if applicable. Okay, there's a lot to digest there. Okay, so I'm going to try to simplify this a little bit. And the first thing I want to make clear is this really demonstrates the importance to us as our sales are pending to be in communication with all of the other providers, the lenders, the title company and so forth, to make sure things are moving along towards closing in how we want them to. In this case, we're also going to be in communication with the buyer's sale of their home and everyone that's involved there, the lenders, the buyer of that home and so forth, to make sure things are moving along well. If it appears as though the sale of the buyer's home is going to be delayed, then it becomes of the highest priority is to get this purchase agreement closing date extended. Okay, because if it's not extended and if the purchase does not close by the closing date, then this is canceled. Okay. Now, when it talks about this language supersedes any other language to the contrary, there is, of course, language within the financing contingencies regarding, whether or not the property closes on time or if a written statement is needed, all of that stuff that we've covered already. And so this does kind of need to be taken into consideration with all that stuff, but this does supersede that. Okay. And then real quick, before I ask Nick to dive in here, option number 3 is the case where the buyer represents that they have the financial ability to perform on this purchase agreement without the sale and closing of any other property. This, of course, would be any first-time home buyer, anyone that doesn't already own a home or own another property, or it could be someone that does own another property, but they are fully qualified to, to have both properties and have 2 mortgages or what have you. So that's what that's all about. And Nick, this is a section with a lot of stuff to digest. Do you have some thoughts and comments?
No, Pat, I think you covered it very well. I one thing I will add, or I will reiterate, is that communication when it comes to sale contingency is key. You got to communicate with that other agent because their clients are stressed. They're thinking about it. When are they going to remove that sale contingency? You over communicate with the other side in this instance because that'll alleviate some tension. So that's my only tip on that one, Pat.
Thank you. And it goes without saying your communication with your client, with your buyer, so that they fully understand that they're at risk of losing this. The purchase agreement is meaningful, of course, but another offer could come in and the seller could bump them. Yeah. So again, we're not going to cover that addendum today, but yeah, it's critically important. So let's move on down to the tax section here, the real estate taxes and special assessments. And here we're talking about the property tax that's assessed by the county, which covers revenue for the county and the city and the school district primarily. And pretty much all properties, unless they're government or church or whatever, pretty much all properties are going to be paying property taxes. And so it's important, of course, for the agreement between the buyer and the seller to be clear on who owes taxes and so forth. So real estate taxes on line 215, seller shall pay on the date of closing all real estate taxes due and payable in all prior years, including all penalties and interest. So everything that's due for prior years, including penalties and interest, has to be paid by the seller. That's standard wording. And again, backing up for a second here, buyers and sellers could negotiate almost anything. Okay. So theoretically, you could have a scenario where a buyer does agree to pay back taxes, and then these lines here would be scratched out. Essentially, you would probably have another addendum added to the purchase agreement that kind of clarifies what's going on. But this is typically what is deemed to be fair in most situations. And so the standard wording that we have in the purchase agreement basically says this. Okay. Now, with regards to this year, line 217, buyer shall pay, and the most commonly used option is that checkbox, prorated from the date of closing. That's what's most commonly used. There's some other options where the buyer could pay all of this year or none of this year or a fraction of this year that might be different than prorating to the closing. But essentially on lines 217 and 218, it says what the buyer shall pay. And then in line 219, it says, in 220, it says what the seller shall pay. Okay. Now, with regards to this year, please keep in mind that all of the taxes have to be paid for this year. And so if they're both checked prorated from the date of closing and prorated to the date of closing, that pretty much covers it. That means the seller is going to pay up until this date of closing and the buyer is going to pay after this date of closing. Actually, I think it's the seller pays up until the day before closing, and then the buyer starts paying on the date of closing. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Or alternatively, one could pay all and one could pay none. Or you could just say, maybe you're going to close in March, but the seller's giving an extra incentive and they're going to pay for the first half of the year, so they could pay 6 months, the buyer pay, So again, this is all negotiable, but most commonly it's just deemed to be considered fair to prorate it to the date of closing. So that's the most commonly used thing here. Then on line 221 and line 222, it talks about non-homesteading, and Minnesota is one of those states, I don't know how many there are, that allows for homesteading, which means if you own the home or duplex or triplex or even I think it's even a fourplex, and you live in it, you can homestead it, and which means your taxes are going to be lower. Now, I think it's going to depend on the price range and everything. I haven't analyzed this of late, but I think roughly on average, it might be about 20-25% lower if it's homesteaded. I don't know for sure. It used to be, 20-30 years ago, where non-homestead was about 2 or 2.5 times higher than the homestead tax rate. It was a huge difference. And this really mattered a lot back then. Now it doesn't matter as much. However, if the property is non-homesteaded, okay, if your buyer's buying a property now and they're going to close in April and it's non-homesteaded, it is non-homesteaded for the rest of the year. Or even if it's partial homesteaded, it's partial homesteaded for the rest of the year. The buyer will be given instructions at closing on how to homestead it. And they can homestead it right after closing, but it's still going to be non-homestead for the rest of the year. And their homesteading of it will get it set up for the following year. Okay. So these lines give the buyer the opportunity to ask for the seller to pay for the difference between the homestead and the non-homestead rate. Okay. So what it says is if the property's tax status is part or non-homestead classification in the year of closing, the seller shall or shall not pay the difference between the homestead and the non-homestead. Okay. Nick, since you're on the forms committee, once upon a time, we used to allow for a dollar amount to be written in here. You probably recall, right?
I remember that.
And it was, I think, honestly, people probably complain, realtors, how do we calculate that and so forth.
Right.
I liked it like that. And the kind of the same reason, now we put down, just shall pay the difference, right? And so my question is, what if it closes on January 15th? Okay. And nobody knows what the difference is going to be because we don't know what the taxes are going to be until about March 1st, and that's why I actually liked having a dollar amount. And people complain, well, we can't calculate it. And I'm thinking to myself, who cares if you're off by a little bit? If you put a dollar amount, at least you have something that's been agreed to by the parties, but I doubt that's going to be something that's going to be changed by the forms committee. And, I think what happens now, if it is like a January closing, I think the closers are going to calculate it based on whatever last year's taxes were, or the difference. So, yeah. So anyway, down on line 223, buyer shall pay real estate taxes due and payable in the year following closing and thereafter, the payment of which is not otherwise here provided. No representations are made concerning the amount of subsequent real estate taxes. So another kind of a whole mouthful of a section. I don't know if you have anything to add, Nick.
Couple things when we're talking prorations to and from day of closing, keep in mind when taxes are paid in Minnesota, right? Remember the 2 months taxes are paid in Minnesota? So there may be a credit due back to the seller for taxes that they paid. So say you close, and Pat, correct me if I'm wrong, if you're closing in November or December, the seller paid the taxes in October, there may be a credit due back to that seller. So keep that in mind when you're counseling buyers, that there might be, I mean, that's nothing you really have to hit on really hard with them, but there just might be some money in there that's either credited backwards or forwards, depending on the proration and when the taxes have been paid. That's
Great.
all I have.
Thank you. Yeah, and that can be complicated and a little bit hard to understand for people, but it's it's all the mathematics on the closing settlement statement. So, Okay, so now we're going to move on to page 6, and we're going to talk about deferred taxes and special assessments. This is very relevant to be right after the tax section, because assessments and so forth do pretty much get added on to the taxes that are due. So that's the method of the common method used for payment of assessments. So usually special assessments, a really good example that I like to share that everyone understands would be whenever they redo streets. So, the streets in the city, particularly in Minnesota, they don't last long because we have extreme weather changes and very hot and very cold weather, and the materials in the streets expand and contract, and you get potholes and so forth. And they need to be maintained on a regular basis. And then every so often they need to be pretty much completely redone. So frequently when the streets are redone, there's going to be an assessment charged to the property owners in that area. And the property owners oftentimes have the option of paying it off all at once, or paying it over a period of time by having it assessed onto their property taxes. And then they make, pay part of it every year for several years. So that's just kind of a common practice there. So here we have like 4 questions with the option of buyer shall pay or seller shall pay. And usually when a buyer's making an offer, they're usually going to want to have all the boxes checked, that seller shall pay. Of course, that's only natural. But what is this stuff specifically? So if we start on line 228, we're first question coming up is really deferred real estate taxes. And that's a different thing than the assessments that I just described. Okay, so deferred real estate taxes, and I don't know if I've ever really remembered encountering this in my career. Maybe I have, maybe I haven't, I don't recall. But essentially deferred real estate taxes are just what it says, taxes that are deferred. So someone doesn't have to pay them now, but they have to be paid, the balance is due or deferred into the future. Okay. So these are commonly, while they've been called green acres, or special assessments, part of which is required as a result of the closing of the sale. So there are certain circumstances where, and Nick, you may know this better than I, and Sarah probably knows this quite well too, because she works more in the rural areas. But there are certain circumstances where property taxes don't have to be paid now, or they're reduced now, or whatever. And then the agreement is with that program that they still are due, but they're going to be paid when the people sell the property. Okay. And so with regards to deferred real estate taxes, this agreement between this buyer and seller basically has the option of saying the buyer shall pay them or the seller shall pay them. Okay. If the buyer is going to pay them, and even if the seller is going to pay them, it becomes critically important for the title work and the title companies or somebody on behalf of the buyer to do the research to determine whether or not there are any deferred real estate taxes. That also applies to all assessments as well. So before I get on to the other 3, Nick, do you have any comment on that?
No, and Pat, I've never ran into a deal with deferred real estate taxes. So I'm not exactly sure what programs aside from green acres apply to something like that. But even in our rural communities and all the sales I've done up in the rural communities in Minnesota, North Dakota, I still haven't run into it. So I'm not sure.
Yeah. We'll check with Sarah, later and see if she's encountered it. But yeah, so that's what that's all about. Now the next 3 are referring to special assessments. And why do you need 3 to deal with special assessments? Well, we'll see right now. So on line 230, it's referring to, it says buyer, the 2 options are buyer and seller shall prorate as of the date of closing, or the seller shall pay on the date of closing all installments of special assessments certified for payment with the real estate taxes due and payable in the year of closing. Okay, so imagine that a few years ago, the streets were redone and there was a $2,000 assessment, and the seller didn't want to pay them all at that time, and they decided to pay it over a period of time, over a period of years, okay? Well, whatever the amount is that's due for this year, that's what this is referring to. So the buyer and seller could prorate it, or the seller could just pay it off, whatever's due for this year. Okay, so very common that the buyer is just going to say, well, we want you just to take care of all that old stuff. And so the seller shall pay, that's the checkbox here. Okay, now let's move on to line 233. Okay, we just dealt with the portion of the assessments that are due and payable this year. On line 233, it says buyer shall assume or the seller shall pay on the date of closing all special assessments levied. That means they've already been levied, probably in the past, okay, as of the date of this purchase agreement. So again, the same scenario. A few years ago, the streets were redone. The seller decided to pay them over time. And so now the seller, is going to, the buyer's going to ask the seller to pay those assessments that are due this year. And they're also, in this case, on line 233, asking the seller to pay all of those assessments that have been assessed and not yet paid. Okay, so all assessments levied as of the date of this purchase agreement. Now, move on to line 235. Okay, what if there are plans to redo the streets this summer? Okay, you have made an offer on a house, and the seller's already got notice that they're going to redo the streets this summer, and they're anticipating the amount charged to the seller to be $2,000. Okay, that's what's considered a pending assessment. That's a pending assessment. So the option here is on line 235, buyer shall assume or the seller shall provide for payment of special assessments pending as of the date of this purchase agreement for improvements that have been ordered by any assessing authorities. That could be the city, the county, whatever. Seller's provision for payment shall be by payment into escrow of 2 times the estimated amount of the assessments or less as required by the buyer's lender. Okay, a lot to kind of a mouthful there, but this is the case where there's already a plan in place to redo the streets. Again, we're using that example, and it's already been ordered by an authority that can order such a thing. So the city or the county, whoever's responsible for the roads, and they've already ordered this. They haven't done the work yet, so they don't know what it's going to cost, but they have an estimate as to what it's going to cost, or they've already got an estimate as to how much they're going to assess each of the property owners that live there, right? But because it's uncertain what that ultimate amount's going to be, okay, if we've got an agreement where the seller shall provide for payment of these special assessments on line 235, if that checkbox is checked, then the wording we have in the purchase agreement is the seller shall provide for payment into escrow of 2 times the estimated amount, okay, or less as required by the buyer's lender. I will add that I don't know this with certainty, but I've seen numerous times in the past where 1.5 times is used for escrow. And so that might be a common amount that lenders might require, but I don't know for sure. But just the understanding here is that putting money into escrow, it's almost always going to be more than the estimated amount, because you just want to make sure, just in case there's, the estimate is wrong and it ends up higher. So put into escrow means that you have a closing that occurs, and part of the seller's proceeds that they're going to receive from the sale is going to be set aside in an escrow account, typically held by the title company. And then, of course, the seller wants to get that money. Okay. And the title company then is waiting for the final bill. And once those streets get done, they're waiting for the final actual levied assessment. And then they'll use that money that's been held in escrow to make that payment, and whatever's left over, they'll send to the seller. Okay? Anything to add, Nick?
Couple things. Now, these 231, 233, and 235 are a stumbling point for a lot of agents. And I've over the years simplified it in my own brain. I'm gonna tell you how I view this so it's easier to remember. So if you go to line 231, and Pat talked about special assessments certified for payment. Certified means the payment for that year. Okay. The payment for whatever those pending, those not pending, but all those levied assessments were for that year. That's the payment. Associate the word certified with payment. That's the single payment that year. Okay. Levied is the balance. Levied is the balance of the total due. So that means if there's an $8,000 street assessment like Pat was talking about, levied is the remainder of that entire balance. Okay. So certified for payment, single payment just in that year. Levied, total balance. Pending is what's coming, not on the tax roll yet. So those are three ways I use to remember those three lines.
Now, I want to mention something else, and I want you to also chime in on this, Nick, from a company policy perspective. And I'm just going to mention this because I've seen problems with this in the past, and it doesn't happen that often. But oftentimes the buyers will fill out the purchase agreement, seller shall pay, seller shall pay, seller shall pay, and so forth. And that makes sense because frequently the buyers don't even know if there's any assessments there.
The agent should do the research, right?
Well, the agent should do the research, yes. But here you are, you've got an offer, it's 3 o'clock, you got an offer due at 5, right? And you got to write the offer up and so forth.
Right.
Okay. You don't even know, what's there. And so it's really, really a risk if you say buyer shall assume, right? Because who knows, it might be $100,000 or something. But the point I want to make is, even if you've got an agreement where the seller shall pay, seller shall pay, seller shall pay, you still need to do the research, because what if they don't pay and then it closes and then the seller goes away and you go after them, but they never pay, right? And so this, what I'm going to bring up is, I don't know with certainty, but I think this is the case. You're going to get title insurance probably. I don't think title insurance covers this stuff. Okay, if this wasn't paid. I do believe that, I know this to be true, that title companies, as a matter of process and so forth, will do research on these things. But I don't think this is actually covered by the title insurance. So if the title company misses it, I don't think it's a guarantee that they're going to pay for it. Because I've seen this happen before where things have been missed and they haven't. Okay. Now I might be wrong on that, but I'm pretty sure. But the point I'm getting at is, it's good for you to be in communication with the buyer's title company and asking just to make sure that they've checked this stuff. It's even better if you've done the research. Okay, if you've contacted the county and so forth. Now I'm going to throw in there right now, a little bit out of order here, but water bills end up getting, if they're unpaid, getting assessed to a property. Okay, and this is something that I've seen happen more than once in the past. So typically the water bill is billed by the city. And I've done a lot of deals in the city of Minneapolis, and Minneapolis is in Hennepin County. When the water bills go unpaid, after a period of time, the city just sends the bill to the county and it gets assessed to the taxes, right? And so what happens is, and I've seen one recently where $1,700 of unpaid was sent to the county for assessment. Okay. And then the seller was still not paying. And so they had a more recent bill that was $1,500. So they owed like $3,200, but $1,700 had already been sent to the county for assessment. So if you called the water utility, the city, the utility department, they would tell you that only $1,500 is due because they've already resolved the $1,700 by sending it to the county to be assessed to the taxes, right? Here's the problem. If you call the county, it's all about timing. You could call the county and they could say, no, there's nothing assessed. Now, even though the city has already assented to them, there's a period of time that takes oftentimes months, like a few months, between when the city sends it to them and when it actually gets assessed to the taxes. So there's really, and this has happened multiple times where water bills have been missed. Okay. And it literally takes an extra question. And the key is when you're calling the utility company with the city and you ask the first question, how much is due on the water bill? And they say $1,500 is due. Okay. You have to ask the second question because they're not going to answer the second question unless you ask. And they're going to have to click onto some other screens to get the answer to the second question. The second question is, have you sent any unpaid water bills to the county for assessment to taxes recently? Okay. And that's where they go, oh, let me check. Click, click, click. Oh yeah, we just sent in December, we just sent $1,700. You're going to miss that $1,700 if you don't ask that extra question. I've seen it happen. I've seen it happen more than once. Anyway, any other thoughts on that, Nick? I'm not sure. Yeah.
Makes total sense, Pat. We used to see that a lot in the foreclosure era.
Totally.
When things were in default and people weren't paying the bills, and that's, I'm sure, what you're speaking of too, Pat.
Totally. It's incredible how much we learned in the foreclosure era, and yes, we're much safer now because, most sellers are, up current on their bills and everything. So.
Well, when it comes to assessments, it's an easy thing to research. And this is a point of difference between a lot of agents, because I know a lot of agents, present company excluded, don't do the research and they don't call the assessing authority, which could be the city, city streets, or they call the county assessor's office. It's an easy phone call. It's an easy phone call, and call them up, call the assessor's office. Is there anything pending? Is there anything I want to verify the levy balance? Tax authorities do have really good technology now where you can log in to the county and see the assessments, or log into a city page and see the assessments. So just get used to doing the research, and that'll eliminate a lot of tripping hazards going forward.
Totally. We're almost at 11. I would like to go down to the middle of this page, if that makes sense, to kind of finish this section off. So, lines 239, buyer shall pay any unpaid special assessments payable in the year following closing and thereafter the payment, which is not otherwise here provided. So that makes sense. The buyer pays the future stuff. And then line 241, as of the date of this purchase agreement, the seller represents that the seller has or has not received a notice regarding any new improvement project from any assessing authorities, the costs of which project may be assessed against the property. So this is like the disclosure that the seller makes, have I received any kind of notice of anything coming up? And then it continues on line 243, any such notice received by the seller after the date of this purchase agreement and before closing shall be provided to the buyer immediately. So this kind of confirms the seller's duty of disclosure, okay? And that duty of disclosure goes all the way up until closing. It's the same thing as the seller disclosure form. If something changes, water comes in the basement or whatever, they have that duty to disclose things that change all the way up until closing. So then it continues. If such notice is issued after the date of this purchase agreement and on or before the date of closing, then the parties may agree in writing on or before the date of closing to pay, provide for payment of, or assume the special assessments. So in other words, if something comes up, you're in kind of a renegotiation state there, okay? And the parties can renegotiate. In the absence of such agreement, either party may declare this purchase agreement canceled by written notice to the other party or the licensee representing or assisting the other party, in which case this purchase agreement is canceled. If either party declares the purchase agreement canceled, buyer and seller shall immediately sign a cancellation of purchase agreement, confirming said cancellation and directing all earnest money paid here to be refunded to the buyer. I want to point out here that we do as much as we can for our clients. We mitigate risk. We try to reduce risk, okay? But you never know when a house might burn down that's pending, or a buyer might lose their job or whatever. There's always some degree of risk. We can't completely mitigate it. This is a prime example where between the date of the purchase agreement and closing, maybe the city's going to, come up and say, we got a project we're going to do, and we're going to have an assessment. And this paragraph right here is basically saying that at this point, nobody's agreed to how that's going to be paid. Okay. So this is actually a risk that the sale could fall apart. Now, to mitigate that risk, either party, they could agree to split it, or one party, the buyer, could agree to pay it all, or the seller could agree to pay it all. Okay. So the buyer and the seller do have the option of keeping things together, either bilaterally by agreeing to split it, or unilaterally where one party just agrees to pay for it. Okay. But this is a good example of, how we do the best we can to mitigate risks, but there still exists some degree of risk out there. So any other thoughts, Nick, before we out for today?
Yeah, one thing, I had this happen to me years ago, represented a buyer on a house in Golden Valley. A week before closing, buyer calls me. The buyer's father was reading the paper and saw there was a notice of a street lamp assessment for $1,000 on the property that his son was buying. Seller didn't let us know. Seller maybe forgot about it, but we ended up negotiating $1,000 a week before closing because they got a letter saying the assessment was coming. So could we have known that? We probably couldn't have, unless the seller was telling us they received a letter. But luckily, the buyer's father was very thorough in reading the paper, so that was $1,000 on the buyer's side. So it's kind of a funny situation, but you can only do what you can do. So doing your research, do the best you can, but these little items may come up. So
exactly. Wow. Thank you. Does anyone here, Joy or Fari, do you have any questions at all?
No, just trying to soak it all in.
No, we're actually dealing with that on the property in Redwood, but yeah.
Okay.
It makes sense. I took good notes.
Well, good. I mean, it's so important to understand these purchase agreements, so we can explain them to our clients.
Yes.
Yeah. And this, I can be honest, guys, the going through the purchase agreement line by line like this is very boring, right? It's very boring. But I can tell you, when you become a perfectionist with this major tool that you use every day as an agent, you're dangerous as an agent. There are a lot of provisions in here that people don't read, or they gloss over, or maybe they were poorly trained. So we spend a lot of time, I'm sure Pat does, helping educate the other side of the transaction on how some of these clauses work, because they really didn't know, or they weren't trained on how to do it, or they needed better advisement. So this is a tool. It's boring. Learn it, and you're only going to really retain it by actually doing it more, right? I mean, you're gonna write more purchase agreements, and you'll go line by line. Pretty soon you'll be able to go line by line in a minute through each page, because you just know the language. Like Pat used to go through these upside down in carbon copies and triplicate with clients in front of them. So you get to know these documents so well. So just give it time. Give it time. You're not going to learn it, in a class with us, but you're going to learn enough to be dangerous to fill it out and always ask questions. And it'll just get better and better and better as your career develops. Exactly. That's my thought. Okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thanks everybody. We'll be continuing on half of page 6 and page 7. You watch the training calendar coming up.
Thank you both.
Okay. Thanks, Pat. Thanks everybody.